What's going on, everyone? Tanner Poppitt here, Madrost and Poppitt's Corner. Just reminding you guys that for the first time ever, Madrost's sophomore album, Into the Aquatic Sector, is now being reissued for the first time on a 2 CD set and vinyl LP. Now, with the CD set, will include a live bonus disc, a live soundboard recording entitled Live Aquatic from that specific era of the band's career. Available now only at NoLifeTomatoRecords.com. What was that link again? Oh, yeah, NoLifeTomatoRecords.com. Now, let's check out the episode you came to see. What's going on, everyone? Welcome to another episode, another edition of Poppitt's Corner, and looking forward to this one. As always, bringing on the other main man of the show, Mr. Shannon Fry. Shannon, once again, how you doing, sir?
I'm good, man. I am good. So, what do we have in store today?
All right. So, what I figured what we would do, and we can branch off obviously on different tangents and topics and whatnot. But what first, let's start here. I think what I want to do is the subgenre topic, and then we can just branch off and see where it goes.
Okay.
So, what I'm kind of wondering is, you know, back in the day, and I don't know the history of when subgenreing came into play, um, but back in the day, I've always been told this by other guests and whatnot that there were literally only two genres in metal in general, and that was hard rock and heavy metal. So I'm just kind of curious the pros and cons to subgenreing this specific music in question. Can we just start with just the history of that to your recollection? Because I don't remember when it changed.
Yeah, as it was progressing, I'm sure we all agree, heavy metal started in 1969, 1970 with Black Sabbath. And as it progressed, metal started bringing new elements of different styles and different ways of doing things into the metal, which then obviously speed metal, thrash metal, doom, crust, grind, symphonic metal, progressive metal, death metal, black metal, and then mixing them all up. So now, because I guess maybe they have gone to a certain point where they feel like they've been sterilized rather, and then they would incorporate a different subgenre into their style of whatever they're playing. So then it empties out into progressive death metal, progressive black metal, experimental, brutal death grind, right? It just keeps going and going. And I feel, yes, it's all heavy metal, but now that heavy metal has branched out into so many smaller branches off that big tree, I'm I don't want to say I'm an elitist, but I will say that there are certain aspects of those other styles that they bring in that doesn't always catch me. So,
Do you think that and I think my answer would be yes, but how much of a part does ego play into these media outlets categorizing and subgenreing metal in general? Because I would assume that it has a lot to do with ego, and that this style of metal doesn't represent metal to me, so I'm going to label it as something else. Does that make
well,
sense to you?
that all kind of started with the labels and not really the media. It started with the labels because they would start putting out ads, and then they would say, like in the early days when thrash was shifting to death metal, and they would say, well, this is thrash slash death metal. And then it would say underneath that for fans of so and so band and so band. So that way you kind of know, okay, well, I like I like Deicide and I like Morbid Angel, and this is like a cross between those two bands. Like, well, that's kind of cool. Or you hear like, what's another good one?
Well, like, I would say, like, black and thrash metal, is that's, like, one
Yeah.
where they blended black metal and thrash? You have, like, I can never pronounce the fucking band name, but what the band to do it was from Texas. OR Noir is I can never pronounce the band. They had Black Thrash Assault.
Oh, they're from Norway, man.
Oh,
Aura
yeah, that
Noir. Yeah.
yes, that band. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
they were, like, the first to do that, so I would
Yeah.
assume that you know, for fans of Venom meets Bathory meets Slayer or something, whatever it is, right?
Uh-huh.
Now, do
Right.
you think subgenre how is it how subgenreing affected metal in general? Because it's almost diversified us. It's almost like segregated us instead of like bringing us all together.
Well, it's segregated because they started putting in things that other people don't like that shouldn't, in their opinion, be involved. Okay, like I don't know if I should use bands, but I'm going to. The band Therion, for example. In the early days, they started off as just a regular death metal band. Little bit of keyboards added in to add the atmosphere, and as they progressed, it became an orchestra with death metal. And then they started adding the clean vocals, and it became this big symphonic type band. Well, not a lot of people like symphonies, especially symphonies in their metal. And Judas Priest, that the album Nostradamus was kind of like, here's heavy metal with an orchestra. It didn't exactly do too well. So, like that's just an example.
Well, then you have bands like Haggard who do it really well that I love. That it has an orchestra. It's like a one guy, one man band. It's fucking awesome. But then you have bands who do that really well and it just works. So do you think that has to do with a lot of like it being accessible? Because I think that plays a huge part into like when certain bands do it better, it's because their music's more accessible. It has more, I would almost call it pop elements, stuff that you can actually kind of latch on to. So it's not super chaotic to where it like doesn't make sense to the average listener, to where the average listener can't get into it. Because I've seen a lot of bands that do it well, like Dimmu Borgir, when back in like what 2009 or 10, I can never pronounce it, but it had a god damn it, what's the album with Hellhammer? They brought Hellhammer on drums. Anyway, um puritanical something something I think is what it was. Regardless of the fact is they that almost transcended that specific genre of black metal and got a lot more regular people into the band because of it, because that album was accessible. Even though it was extreme already, but the songs and how they arranged it was just so accessible to the average metal fan that's what I think could benefit a lot of these subgenre-ing of bands per se. I think I almost would prefer it when if labels and I don't know, PR stuff, marketing said for fans of A band, B band, and C band instead of calling it progressive death metal or this, that, and the other, because I think it's almost hindering a large audience to get into that band because some people might not like progressive death metal. Does that make sense? So if you
Right.
have bands that people are into instead, I think that would benefit a lot more. It would just unify, I think, a lot more. What are your thoughts on this? Could this be done?
I think that the spacing of what goes into that. Okay, like back in the day, they were in magazines, so they were in print. You can see basically it was on 8 by 12, and there it was. The one album, the song title, the album title, and then underneath it, progressive whatever, blah 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 and blah 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 style with for fans of blah 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 and blah blah blah. Okay, I mean, yeah, you can do that if you're talking to somebody, I guess, or you're writing a paragraph on your social media if that's what you're using or whatever. I think it could be beneficial because it would narrow your um, dislikes and likes down. You know, okay, progressive thrash. If you're a fan of Believer and Atheist and Creator and Slayer, well, then this band's for you. Okay, and then you'd be like, well, I like them, and I like them, and I like them, and I like them. So that this band has to be awesome. But then you find sometimes, well, didn't exactly pull that off too well, and I mean, because you're always taking a gamble. Every album you listen to, every album you buy, you're taking a gamble. Just depends on, does that particular gamble satisfy the person's ears? So, I mean, it's good.
What is more beneficial to a band? For fans of so and so and so and so, or labeling it as a subgenre? What's more beneficial for a band per se?
Well, right away, that sub-labeling of the sub-labeling, to me, right there benefits you right away. You know, to me, um, for, like we'll use Madrost. We all know it's progressive, it's death metal, and it's thrash, all in the same bubble. Progressive death thrash metal. Okay. Well, when you know progressive, you know it's going to be odd time signatures everywhere. It's death metal, you know it's going to be heavy and it's going to be harsh. The thrash metal, you know it's going to be to the face, to the
And it's also going to be a little bit accessible, though, because I
right,
found more
right,
thrash metal is more accessible than death metal, and
right. It's a little more
so
catchy.
so if you like, I've always found like death thrash stuff, I gravitate towards just because I just think that's a more accessible type of music. I'm always after songs, dude. I'm not after this like wankery of fucking million notes an hour, right?
Hmm.
I want good songs.
Yeah, yeah,
So, but and a PR's firm's job is to, attract a new audience for that said band, right? That's what you're paying them to do.
right.
So I'm not bagging one bit. It's whatever you prefer. I would just always like it if I guess I just gravitate more towards a certain style, and probably I'm probably a hypocrite in saying this, and it probably kills my whole argument of if subgenres are good and whatnot. There are pros and cons to it, in my opinion. I guess is what I'm trying to get at. But back in the day, you only had literally two types of genres. There was heavy metal and hard rock. That was it. In the 80s, from what I've been told, that was it.
Early 80s.
Correct.
Yeah, once 83 came along is when it started shifting a little bit. By 1989, 1990, it completely changed. And as it's progressed, it's just gotten even five, six subgenres tacked onto one band. It's like, well, I don't know. Now you're really taking a gamble because,
See, and I think let me make the argument on the opposite side for when uh PR places say for fans of this band, and this band. Well, if you put Metallica, regardless of the fact of nobody sounds like Metallica, nobody will ever sound like Metallica, right? So what era of Metallica are they basing it off of? So that becomes a huge point too. It's like, what era of that band does this band sound like for fans of?
hmm hmm
That's where it gets
right,
confusing.
right, right. Or any other band for that matter.
Yeah, exactly, right? So you almost have to take a chance on it just from like, is it early stuff from that band? Okay, let's give it a like, and then obviously the first 30 seconds people turn it off, if they don't
Right.
like it, right? They don't even get to like the first, the if the first song sucks on an album, they just skip the whole album. So that's why I always felt like it's super important to cater to that, knowing that like if this is the first drop of the needle that somebody's going to listen to it, this is the first note that somebody's going to hear, that song has to be mind blowing, right? Then you could put like maybe a not so great song afterwards, right? Because you have to get like, how are you going to get people into your band? You want to hit
Right.
them where it hurts. You want to hit them just like boom, 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 boom. It's like, whoa,
Right.
that was fucking awesome. I
Hmm.
found a lot of bands like that. I've
Yeah.
almost found it's like a disservice to a lot of bands who don't do that because there's so much competition. It's like you're almost forced to do that. Does that make sense? And especially if you're like a band with with progressive tendencies and whatnot, that is a red flag almost to a lot of listeners too. Because not like I said, not a lot of people like the progressive metal in general. Some people don't like or are only into like straightforward heavy metal, right? And I found a lot of those bands suffer from the same thing where it's they write the same riff as every other fucking standard traditional heavy metal band, right? Especially today. But there's some of those gems, man, that just kick you in the face as soon as you drop the needle on. And when you find that gem, it's like, fuck, I wish everything was like this. So, in saying that, you almost have to start off just hard and heavy, and then you can experiment a little bit more,
Right.
you know, uh, because
Exactly.
because if let's take a very highly progressive band. I don't want to name them, but they started in the '90s. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, right? If that band came out today, there's 50 million bands that sound like that said band, right?
Right.
How are you going to set yourself apart? Well, you got to have the songs. And a lot of these
Right.
progressive bands don't have the songs. They just have a bunch of wankery. Like, let's go
Right.
back to a couple weeks back when you mentioned the AI death metal thing, right? I went and checked that shit out. That sounds like 40 million technical progressive death metal bands out there, which is why I don't like the term progressive death metal because that's a form that doesn't sound like what I'm talking about when I'm talking about progressive death metal, right? And that plays some sort of into the ego mind that I mentioned earlier too. So I don't know how much of that plays into part with you know that specific subgenre and whatnot and subgenreing in general. So what is your take on that? And hopefully I'm even making sense to you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that AI thing, getting back to that AI thing, that's just a bunch of shit thrown into one, you know. It has progressive shit, it has brutal death metal shit for sure. It's got a bunch of slam breakdown parts and whatever and
Right. So let's take this is a perfect example, not to cut you off. This is a perfect example, and I want to get your take on this. So if you're marketing this to
mhm.
people like us that are going to be interviewing bands and reviewing bands, and you want to get this music out there, how do you market that to somebody? How would you market it to be like, how is this going to reach a new audience? Or are we only going to pertain to an audience that only likes the style of music?
That's usually how it goes. The latter is how it goes. Usually with the more aggressive style anyway. I mean, you could say, yeah, you're death metal, but I don't know what's death metal. Okay, right? To me, death, asphyx, grave, dismember, that's death metal. Then you got the brutal death metal. Well, that suffocation, cannibal corpse, right? And then it goes on and it goes on. Um, but when it gets to a certain point, right, and now you're taking that and you're adding progressive stuff to it. Well, the in specific that brutal death metal dude 99% of the time really doesn't like the progressive aspect of it. So instead of being overly progressive, they'll do it in spurts, to attract that. So maybe that guy will like it because, as you listen to it, it's all over the fretboard, and well, I like five here and I like six here and I like one or two here and then five here in those bars of as it goes, you know. Um, anyway, on to something else. Like it seems that I don't know. I forgot what I was talking about.
Well, let me jump in real quick if you don't mind. And some somebody's, you know, f- um, describing brutal death metal, like you're describing it as like the old school suffocations and whatnot. That isn't brutal death metal to somebody else. That their recollection or their how they perceive brutal death metal are like bands of like 2010 era slam death metal bands that you know like they're not suffocation. Like suffocation to me is like it's a death metal band, right? Now you get into the brutal death that to me that has a stigma attached that it's like 2005 and up, and I'm like next because I won't ever listen to that stuff. So there's some stigmas attached to that.
But those brutal death metal bands have just upped the ante from 90 to 2020, right? That intensity has grown, and the playing has almost almost doubled in speed, if I want to say. Maybe not that much, but what quite a significant amount. Well, yeah, somebody who's just a normal, just getting into heavy metal ain't gonna really go for that because that's just way too much, you know. So that's the kind of the other thing is like it's because the labeling of things was just like we said earlier to get people into those newer bands that are um, influenced by a little older of those bands. So now, but if you were to say, okay, like I'm sorry if I'm going blank here, but if you take like a new brutal death metal band, for example, and you say, well, for fans of Cerebral Rot and whoever else these other bands are, well, I'm not really familiar with many of those bands. So what would that do for me? I could care less at that point, you know?
Well, sure, but a lot of bands don't really care about being accessible either. When you're playing like a brutal style of metal, your main thing is not to get a lot of people into your music because that genre is very niche to begin with. And I'm just being honest here, dude.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know,
And I
I
was
I
trying to say that without being negative.
well,
It's just
uh,
hard.
well, there you go, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not being negative about it. You're
No,
just that's
not at all.
you set out to make a band that you want a certain niche audience to get into, and that's okay. That's why we start
Uh-huh.
bands for different reasons.
Right, right,
I just to move the genre forward, to move the metal genre forward in general, you need bands that are accessible, but it can still be brutal and heavy and fast and slow and have dynamics and not have us, be afraid to do that stuff and
right,
be,
right,
have the criticisms of that niche fucking genre to come down hard on you. So it's like, bands need to obviously not be afraid to experiment a little bit in that genre to help build that genre and kind of pertain it and gain for it to gain a whole new audience. Does that make sense to you? Like a lot of punk bands did that in the 90s. I mean,
right.
case in point, I know we don't like talking about them, but that's fine because I'm a 90s kid. Green Day is a prime example of a punk band that fucking gained a whole wide success, and the punk community fucking hated them. In fact, it's
Uh-huh.
been well documented in documentaries, you know,
Oh
that
yeah.
happened. I think they got banned at some club in help me out here. Is it not the Fillmore, but some club in San Francisco? It's
Huh. Maybe they
I'm
got
blanking
banned.
on it.
They get banned from Berkeley
I can't remember what it is,
because
but
I know
somebody from mhm.
the city of Berkeley has a famous club, and I don't remember what it's called, but it's a main punk club, Gilman, the
Yes.
Gilman
Yeah,
Street
so they
Club.
got banned from Gilman's because they got so popular that people revolted at them, right? And
Yeah.
I just think that they did a lot for you can argue with me all day, but the fact of the matter is they did a lot for that style of music, dude.
Oh,
Punk they
absolutely,
pop
they did.
pop punk or punk rock, whatever it is, in the
Uh
90s is
huh.
completely different than what punk was in the 70s and the 80s, dude.
Right, right,
It's
and
just
then
facts.
kind of odd that it was bigger in the '90s than it was in the '70s. The '70s had the classic bands, but '90s had that It was like the metal field for us in
Yeah,
the
well,
80s.
90s have classic bands too, man. I think ever since the Nirvanas came out, that made music kind of go down a notch and simplified it.
Mhm.
It gave room to punk bands to go to the mainstream, like the Offspring and bands of this, because they were massive in those days. The Blink 182s, the Sum 41s, they were
Mhm.
massive in
Yeah,
in the 90s and early 2000s and whatnot. So the Nirvanas and Alice in Chains made room for those bands to become the next big thing,
right.
right? We don't have that anymore. I don't see fucking bands doing that nowadays because
No.
everyone's so afraid to do that almost. And if they're not, it's like, they don't want to either. And also too, there's no really avenues promoting those bands to get them to that next level.
Uh-huh.
Music's totally changed, and especially
Every
in the
way.
last, like, 2 to 3 years even. I was thinking about this too, man. If we made certain albums from our career now, they wouldn't have the same effect on the metal scene like they did when they first came out,
Right. Right.
right? So
Right.
if case in point, if you guys made Death Brigade that came out now, nobody
It
would
wouldn't
care.
fly.
Yeah,
Yeah, it wouldn't
nobody would
fly.
give a shit, right? But
Yeah.
because you did it at a time when that scene was massive and you had all the support to it, then it became infused in that genre and is now cemented in that genre,
Right. Right.
right?
Exactly.
So, and in that point, I almost think the subgenreing worked, right?
Yeah.
Because thrash metal again is more accessible than the more extreme styles of metal in general,
Yeah.
you know.
Because it's that perfect blend of metal and hardcore.
And some pop elements because it has a lot of catchy choruses and whatnot too that people can get into, but it also has a lot of dynamics that you can infuse in it as well, right? Most of the famous thrash bands do that. I don't wanna name any of them, but you know who I'm talking about. Most of them infuse a lot of dynamics in their music, so I think with that comes more subgenres and I don't know, but then it becomes like, is there gonna become a point where it's so ridiculous, even more ridiculous nowadays, than what it is now, where it's not even worth it to fucking subgenre anything anymore? Are we gonna get to a place where there's no they no longer exist? It's only if you like this band and this band, then you'll like this band.
But how would you know? See, that's the other part. There's no way of even saying that if you like this band and this band that would, you know what I mean? Because it's already so branched out even beyond what it is now. What is that going to be? How is that going to react to people? Wow. That's when you have 10 subgenres tacked onto one, even though, yeah, it ends in metal at the very end.
And then we wouldn't know that until it actually happened. So we're just only speculating. If let's
Yeah.
say it did happen. I mean, I have no idea. I have no idea what would be next.
I'd probably give up by then. You know?
Well, there probably is some truth to that, and just but yeah, man, it's like I think it's all a marketing thing when it comes to the subgenring as well. That just plays a huge part in it. It's like,
It does.
and man, it's just brutal. And I don't know what the state of music is going to look like this year or the next, or just because of so much stuff that's happened politically wise, and it's brutal.
Politically, socially, and
Morally,
within music itself, like the sounds, the intensity of things, the melodies that they're coming with nowadays, emphasizing new, like when you start bringing, like, we'll use Nile for example. When they came out, right, they started all this Egyptian, Middle Eastern type melodies and harmonies in their scales and whatever, and it became something huge. So now you have Egyptian death metal, right? Uh, Now what's next for that? What's next? Progressive jazz, Egyptian death metal, right? With with Doom.
Well, but here's the thing, there are other, like, when I think of, like, let's go to jazz. You mentioned jazz. I wanna go to this genre and kind of almost compare it to metal, right? Because jazz is just jazz. You have West Coast and East Coast jazz, right? And then but, like, most of the people, that's all they know, West Coast and East Coast jazz, right? They're 2 different types of jazz, but they all blend into one, and then it's just jazz, right? Metal's not like that.
Well, jazz has its own subgenres within that too. Acid jazz and like right big band jazz and there's like a lot of that too, but they ain't as ridiculous as metal is. Metal is like the most ridiculous of all the subgenres of music in general. Metal's like the worst for subcategorizing.
I would agree. But how many different types of pop are there? There's like 1 or 2, dude.
Just one, just pop.
Just pop, right?
Yeah.
But pop also has, like, not a shelf life of 20 or 30 years with a band. It's very rare that you find those bands that have a shelf life of more than 3 or 4 years, dude. But a lot of the metal bands in the '80s almost had a shelf life of 3 to 4 years to it too.
hmm Well, the pop aspect is famous for 15 minutes till the next pop thing comes along. Metal kind of, I mean, you have your one hit wonders, right? We're going back to the pop thing a second. It was always the one hit wonders. 70s and the 80s were super huge for that. By the time the 90s came around, it was all about the album again. So then it was all, okay, well, enough of the songs. What's the album? And then it became the song again. All these years later, it became the song again, the one song. And it's even got a shorter shelf life now. When before the 70s and the 80s, you could still turn on the radio and there they are. The 90s, they had their hit songs. That was like the last era of like the album and the hit. Nowadays, it's no album, it's the hit. That's it. You get one song and that's it. That's in the pop world.
Sure.
In the metal world, it's still, I think, about the album because us metalheads are so attached to our physical product that physical product actually, all those songs on that CD or on that vinyl or on that cassette, those all mean something. I don't think it's the same with the pop category of music.
Sure. No, you make some great points, and I wanna branch off of this too, let me ask you this, because I mean, we could dedicate a whole episode to this. Who are the next classic rock bands? Who's gonna be the next classic rock bands that are playing on the radio, right? Because it recirculates every 20 years. They're still gonna be playing the same hits from the '70s and '80s and
Uh huh.
'60s and '90s and '80s, right? But who are the bands that are gonna be the next classic rock even in the next 5 years? I only
Well,
can name, like, 2. The
I
Foo
can name two.
Fighters, it would be one, and bands of that stature.
Them and Greta Van Fleet. I think those are the two. That I think, and I think the era of classic rock, as we know it today, isn't going to be classic rock in the next generation.
Will we have terrestrial radio in 20 years or 5 years or whatever? I have no idea. I don't
That's
know that
hard to
specific
say.
business because you have 4 different types of fucking radio now. You got terrestrial, you got that now the Sirius thing, you got, uh, Spotify, podcasts.
Uh huh.
Yeah, you got 20 million internet radio stations, so you got a lot to choose from. It's not
Right.
like it was back then when you had, like, 2 avenues to choose from with MTV and the radio. That's all you had. Nowadays, you got 40 million choices. So who knows?
Uh-huh. And all you need is a license.
Yeah.
Purchase the license and be able to make your own radio station. You know, you can even do it right now for free. Make your own radio station. I ain't gonna give names, but you can do it. I don't see, but then that narrows down the other ones who actually are meaningful. So,
I want to ask you this too, and this has nothing to do with the subgenre per se, but it has to do with radio and just helping bands get out there more and more. It used to be that you could get away with playing a band song without being doxxed or demonetized, right? But ever since that came into play and whatnot, I almost feel it's hurt bands and hurt sales in general by corporate greed, label greed, and whatnot to try and do that on people's podcasts and whatnot. Because I can't play a song on my podcast because I'll get you know legal action and whatnot. Like I won't even chance it. I really feel if we had that capability of doing that and not having to shell out $300 a month to do it, um, it would totally benefit more bands, man.
yeah, it would. So that's one of the things that's hurting the new bands, I think. You know, unless said specific band that you're playing doesn't give a shit and they're happy to be on there anyway.
Well, but here's the thing: most of those bands, though, not to cut you off, most of those bands go through a digital service to get their stuff onto all the digital platforms. So that acts as their label going after these podcasts and stuff in general.
Uh huh.
That's why you'll see, if you go on like a lame tube, as I'll call them, and you see a song, and it'll say underneath it who that song is, what that song is, the band, who owns it, right, who licensed it. You'll see all
Orchard
that shit,
music 99% of the time.
right? There's
Hmm.
and it's a total scam, that specific company that you mentioned. Uh, I've been told some things, obviously, where it's fucked up, dude. You know, but
Hmm.
it can totally benefit bands. But I think greed has taken that just out of the equation.
Yeah.
I don't think people give a shit in helping bands.
Not anymore. Not
I just don't
anymore.
think that happens.
No. Now it's up to the band to push their own self.
Which means that they won't go anywhere because again, you need that collective.
Hmm.
We need to have a team and
Yep.
build that from the ground up, and that's what we're doing here. We've been
Right.
doing it for fucking what,
A while.
4 years now on Poppitt's Corner, and we're gonna keep continuing to do it no matter who's listening in, and
Mm.
that's just the way it rolls, man. I enjoy doing this so much, and I know you do as well, to where it's like we're not gonna stop. We're just gonna
Right.
keep doing it
Yeah.
because why not? You know,
Right.
it's needed in a time like this. So especially with underground killer metal bands, they need our help, and we need to work together. They need to support us, and we need to support them. So I when we interview bands and whatnot, they need to share the fucking interview, and we need to share the fucking interview, right? And there's certain things that bands could do more of to help make this whole thing grow too. There's certain things we can do more of to help make this thing grow as well,
Right.
right? It's
Right.
two-way street. It's
It
it's kind
is.
of hard to, and not to go on too much of a tangent, but it's the truth.
Uh huh.
We need to work together. We need to continue to work together and change a few things, because change is good, right? And that's
Yeah.
what I'm going to end this specific podcast on. But Shannon,
Right.
any final words from you, sir?
Just keep listening to what you listen to, no matter what the subgenre. Find out what works for you, and just keep listening. Supporting new bands, supporting the bands that you've liked. Just keep pushing the metal.
Let the metal flow, right?
Let it
It's a
flow.
perfect way to sum it up. But for Shannon and myself, thanks again so much, everyone, for tuning in, and we're out of here, guys. Cheers.